You ready? If you'll come on in and find a seat, it's about time for us to get started. We are glad you are here tonight. I'm glad all of you that are online watching and studying along with us are. And we don't say this very often, but those of you that are online, if you will like this feed, whether you're watching it on YouTube or Facebook, if you'll like it, if you'll share it, if you'll comment on it, then that makes all those algorithms say, hey, this is something that people are engaging in, and it'll pop up in other people's feeds, and other people will get to see it. So if you would share it, we would appreciate that, and comment and like it and all that kind of stuff. And those of you that are here, if you'll open up your Bibles to Romans chapter 1, we're going to continue talking about the gospel of God. And we mentioned last week, I think it was, maybe the week before, I was telling you that this good news that he's starting off with, he's emphasizing gospel. He uses it in the first 18 verses that uses that word 3 times, talks about it all throughout. But there's the good news, and then we're going to talk about a bunch of bad news. But we've still got one more Wednesday night of good news. Then we'll get into some bad news, and then we're going to talk about a bunch of good news. So we're going to go back and forth a little bit. But as we talked about last week, you got to know the bad news before you can get the good news sometimes, and that's what we're at with Romans. And as we've tried to talk about all along, you know, Romans is it's a meat book. You know, this is not milk of the word stuff. This is meat stuff here. And Danny Cash was telling me this morning that he's been going to the other adult class back on the singing class, and he said that he and Sheila have been watching this class then on YouTube on Monday nights or Tuesday nights and studying along. And he said, man, every time we get done, he said, I got to go get a toothpick and get all that meat chunks out of my teeth. And I said, well, they're there, but I'm trying to make it as simple for us as we can, and try to simplify it down so we can, kind of catch what it is that Paul's talking about through all of this. But we've spent a couple of weeks talking about the opening part of this, and we kind of broke down the introductory sentence that lasts the first few verses here, where basically Paul is saying, this is from Paul, it's to all y'all in Rome, is who he's writing to. And we've talked about how really the problem is the fact that it's all y'all, it's Jew and Gentile, and we'll see that more in our text tonight, what we're going to get into. But the way that he's going to try to deal with the problems that they have of being divided between Jew and Gentile is to try to help them see about salvation and how intertwined the same Savior and the same need and the same hope and whatnot that they have. Last week we talked about Paul's prayer, and just to kind of break it down a little bit, the first couple of verses he talks about how he was thankful for their commitment and their example, how dedicated they were to the cause of Christ, and how that they were sharing it with others, and that reputation, that example had spread all over. And then in verses 10 through 13, he talks about how much he longed to be with them. And he tells them some reasons why that he longed to see them, to impart to them a spiritual gift, to encourage them, and then in turn he could be encouraged by them, and to harvest some fruit from the work that he could do there. And that gets us down to where we're really going to get focused on this evening. Romans chapter 1 and verse 14. And Romans chapter 1 and verse 14 begins a section. Let me flip over to the Bible thing here. Romans chapter 1 and verse 14 begins a little section here where there's those of you that want to preach or get an opportunity to preach. It's a great sermon outline for you. Here you've got 3 I am statements that Paul's going to make mention of. Notice I've got them blocked out in dark blue there, but in verse 14 he says I am, verse 15 he says I am, and in verse 16 he says I am. And he's going to make 3 points in those. I had a guy one time at a different congregation, not this one, at a different congregation that I preached at, and he asked me one time, he said, "Where do you get your sermon outlines from?" And I said, "From the Bible." And he said, "No, I mean what writer do you get them from?" I said, "Oh, I get them from Paul and David and Jesus." And he got plumb mad at me. He thought I wouldn't tell him my sources, but it really is right there for you, the 3-point outline that Paul's going to give you about, still talking about the gospel. So we'll just start with verse 14, and we're going to probably not get too far tonight, but we're going to go back and notice a little bit about the gospel and where that comes from and whatnot. But I want you to first see this idea of I am and how that he's going to emphasize that. Let me go back over here. Because what he's going to do, let me try that again. There we go. What he's going to do, we talked about this back in our introductory material, so we won't spend a lot of time on it, but I want to show how it applies to this section we're going to look at tonight. If you remember, we talked about how that the gospel is an idea that comes all the way back from Isaiah 52 and 53 in particular. Gospel is one of those words that we kind of throw around and use in the church and maybe don't really define it very well sometimes or realize that this isn't something that they just came up with off the cuff. But the gospel is the good news about Jesus, is what it really is all about. But that good news had been, that idea of the good news has all the way back since Isaiah had been there, see? And but it's all about, you know, the Gospel of Mark starts with the beginning of the gospel of God, and then the Gospel of Mark ends with go into all the world and preach the gospel. And it's all about Jesus and about how that He's God the Son that took on flesh and lived a perfect life, and He lived a righteous life and then died on a cross for us. But we talked about how here in Isaiah chapter 52 and verse 7 is where this idea of good news or gospel comes from. In fact, if you're reading a different translation besides the ESV, some of them have gospel in verse 7. But how beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of Him who brings good news, who publishes peace, who brings good news of happiness, who publishes salvation, who says to Zion, your God reigns. And then we noticed over in verse 10 that the Lord has bared His holy arm before the eyes of all the nations. And we talked about how that when He talks about the arm of God, He's talking about the strength of God. And all the ends of the earth shall see the salvation of our God. And then in chapter 53, the very next chapter, the very first verse of the next chapter of Isaiah, he says, who has believed what he has heard from us, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? This is right before he's going to go into all of that section where he talks about the suffering servant, right? The Messiah that's going to come, and how that he's going to endure things for us, for our salvation, right? So, I don't know why I don't want to play nice sometimes, but we'll make it. That's where he's coming from, all this idea with the gospel. So when we think about this section that we're going to look at tonight, I want you to go back and notice how I've got some of this highlighted. That gospel, that good news from Isaiah 52 verse 7 in yellow there. Well, if you go over to Romans chapter 1 verses 14 through 17, notice he talks about I'm eager to preach the gospel. Well, where does he get that from? All the way back in Isaiah 52 and verse 7. He talks about the gospel and how it is the power of God. In it, he says, is the righteousness of God. All right, so back in verse 7, he talks about salvation. That's what this good news is, this gospel is going to bring to us. And notice that he says that the gospel is the power of God for salvation. See? And then in verse 10 of chapter 52, he talks about this, that it's for all the nations, that it's for the ends of the earth, right? Well, in Romans chapter 1, notice he talks about how that it's for the Greeks and the barbarians. It's for the wise and the foolish. He's ready to come and preach the gospel to you who are at Rome also. That's everybody. And then he says it's for everyone, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. Are you with me? Am I making this up? It's right there, isn't it? And then if you notice in chapter 53 and verse 1, he talks about believing what he has heard from us. That's the gospel or the good news. And then this power of the Lord. Well, notice what he says here. He talks about how that it's for everyone who believes. And he talks about it's revealed from faith for faith. And then he's going to quote Habakkuk chapter 2 and say that the righteous shall live by faith, right? And then he talked about that the strong arm of God. But what does he say is the strong arm or the power of God? It's the gospel. Are you with me? It's the power of God. You see all that? So see how much of this is highlighted in these few verses that you can directly tie back to Isaiah 52 and 53. Are you with me? That's where this has all come. This is not new information. But Paul's not coming up with something that this is the first time anybody's ever heard it before, and that's important because that's one of his points he's going to make as he moves forward into the bad news sections. But this idea of good news and what it does and what it's for is what they've been waiting for and longing for and praying for and looking for centuries and centuries, all the way back to Isaiah. So notice what he says. We'll get into the text here. Notice what he says in verse 14. He says, I am under obligation both to Greeks and to barbarians, both to the wise and the foolish. The first I am statement that he makes is I am under obligation. I have an obligation to serve, to do, to preach and teach is what he's going to really talk about, that he feels obligated to do. Now, why would Paul feel obligated to teach others the gospel? He'd been told that he was supposed to. Why else would he feel obligated? Because of what Christ did for him. Somebody else said something else? Because the persecution. Here's another thing. Did somebody teach Paul the gospel? Who taught Paul the gospel? Well, Jesus started it. Ananias. Remember? Go in the city and there to be told what you must do. And remember, Ananias, one of the things he said when the Lord told him go, he's like, are you sure about this? Because I heard what he's done. Yeah. So what if Ananias hadn't gone? Well, we can say the Lord would have sent somebody else, and I'm sure he would have, but the idea is that because Paul was taught something that he didn't know before, he felt obligated to tell others. And if there was, if there was some sort of, you see it in every movie or action adventure show, whatever it is, there's the aliens are attacking and they finally figure out this is the way to stop that particular alien, or there's some kind of disease, or there's some kind of whatever. Somebody finally figures out this is the way to stop the bad guys. What do? All right, don't tell anybody. What do? They go tell everybody, right? And when you find out, you won't tell somebody else because you're so thankful to know what it was. Well, in a real sense, and even a greater sense, that's the idea here. And so understand, this is not just because Paul's a preacher, and it's not just because Paul is an apostle why he feels an obligation to teach. And y'all talked about some of those things, and that certainly would have added to his sense of obligation. But Paul has a sense of obligation to tell others about the good news about Jesus because he was taught the good news about Jesus. And so who should that affect in this room? Every single one of us. See? So when you get on over to Romans chapter 8 and verse 12, he's going to talk about this obligation that we all ought to feel to serve God, to not be physically motivated or physically focused, but because God has saved us and because the Spirit indwells us and all of those things, he said we ought to be motivated not to be focused on physical things, but on spiritual things. Do we feel, we're getting personal now, can we get personal? Do we feel an obligation to be focused on spiritual things when we talk with people? We should. And that's what Paul was feeling here. Now notice he says it's an obligation both to Greeks and to barbarians. The Greeks would be people that they would have considered educated. They spoke the Greek language and would have made some sense. When you read the word barbarian, don't think about Conan, okay? That's not the kind of barbarians we're talking about. That was their word for anybody that didn't speak Greek, that was some sort of other nationality that they would consider uneducated because the way that they heard them talking, it sounded like bar, 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 bar. That's how they got barbarian. But that was they didn't understand them, so they thought they were uneducated. And we do the same thing sometimes, don't we? Y'all know that I've had opportunity to teach online to some schools overseas, and I taught a school in Malawi 3 classes last year during the nighttime, and it was funny because one of the students there, he's apologizing to me. He's trying to ask a question, and he says, I'm so sorry. He said, I can't say the English word. I'm not smart. And I'm like, brother, you speak 5 different languages, and you write 3 of them. I can't even write or speak my own language correctly, you know. You're very intelligent, but it's easy to look at somebody else that didn't talk like that. Well, that's what he's saying. And so when he says to the wise and the foolish, it's just saying the same thing again, but that really incorporates everybody. From the Roman perspective, you were either Greek or you were a barbarian. You were either educated or you were uneducated. You were wise or you were foolish. And Paul says, this obligation that I have, that I feel to share the gospel with everybody is literally for everybody. All right, verse 15, his second I am statement. I am eager to preach the gospel to you who are, let me do it this way and maybe I can do this. I'm eager to preach the gospel to you. Whoops. I'm out of practice. I'm eager to preach the gospel to you who are at Rome or who are in Rome. So included in all of that is I want to preach the gospel to those of you who are in Rome. Now, if you think of his obligation, we think sometimes of an obligation as a drudgery, don't we? I've got to take out the trash, or I've got to go visit my in-laws, or I've got to, whatever it might be. If you're thinking that Paul, when he says, well, I'm obligated, don't hear him say that as if to say, well, I've got to teach it to you. I don't really want to. Because not only is there a sense of obligation, but he says, I am eager. I'm excited to teach the gospel to you. I'm excited to tell you about salvation and about Jesus and about what He means. Now, if you'll remember back the last couple of weeks, who is he writing this letter to? People in Rome. Which people in Rome is he writing it to? To the church, right? He's not writing people that are outside of Jesus. He's writing people that are already in Christ. So why would Paul, why do you want to tell them the gospel, right? There was it's been years ago, but there was some guys that were actually, what they were trying to do was dismiss certain teachings that is in the Bible that they said wasn't something that we needed to be binding on people. And what they tried to do was they said that there's a difference in gospel and doctrine. See, and gospel is for people outside the church, and doctrine is for people in the church. See, and this is one of the verses that was used to refute that. Who's he going to teach the gospel to? To the church. See, so doesn't the church know about Jesus? Well, yeah. But there's still some things that they're not really quite getting or understanding. You know, Webb and I've told y'all about, in fact, Webb got on to me Sunday for telling y'all about our little mini Bible studies that we had. He said, "You're going to get me fired." And I said, "No, they won't do it." But anyway, he said, we were talking about baptism and about Jesus, and we got talking about the Lord's Supper, and we had all kinds of things. And one of the things that Webb made mention of, he's out in the hall right now, he's leaving. See, no, I'm just kidding. I'm telling him that you got on to me for talking about us talking. But anyway, he said that we were talking about the fact that... That's right. That's true. That's true. But he knows that before he comes in there. See, so... but one of the things that Webb said was the fact that, you know, those topics we were talking, he said, I've been studying it for 70 years, I don't understand it all. And there's always more we can understand and learn, right? But particularly for these people, they're so focused on the wrong ideas of salvation and righteousness and even faith and belief. And we've kind of talked about some of those ideas already. We're going to get into it even more as we move forward. But they need to know some stuff. I'm eager to preach, and he's ready to share with them this gospel. He's wanting to tell them more about Jesus, wanting them to understand more about Jesus. Notice he says it's the gospel, which he's talked about it in verse 1. He's talked about it in verse 9. He's going to talk about it again in verse 16. All of that comes back from our passages in Isaiah. Isaiah 52:7, Isaiah 52:10, Isaiah 53:1 that we looked at. That's the idea of where he's getting all of this information that he's talking about here. So I'm under obligation. I've got to tell you about the gospel. But I'm eager to tell you about the gospel. So why, Paul, do you feel this sense of obligation, and why are you so eager, excited to tell people about Jesus? Well, he's going to tell us. For, verse 16, that means, I'm going to tell you the reason why now. For, here's our third I am statement, I am not ashamed of the gospel. I'm not ashamed of it. Now, we talked about a few minutes ago about how we ought to feel an obligation, and we ought to be eager to share the gospel. But why aren't we spiritually focused as much with our friends and neighbors and family? Well, lots of reasons that we could talk about, but this might be the number one, is that sometimes we're just ashamed. And the idea behind this word is the idea of a feeling that keeps you from doing what you ought to do. I'm afraid of how somebody might take it, or I'm afraid that I might offend them, or I'm afraid they might think I'm a goody two-shoes, or they might not like me, or whatever. And to a certain extent, we do need to think about how we share things with others. And you know, we've talked about this before, but whenever we make abrasive Facebook posts or Instagram posts or whatever, I've never heard anybody say, "Well, I saw that Facebook post and you were kind of mean and snippy with me, but it helped me to see the light, so teach me." You know, that just doesn't happen. We need to think about how we're presenting the gospel, but at the same time, we've got to figure out how to teach the truth in love to people. We've got to be willing to share it with others. And he tells us why, that he's not ashamed. He says it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greeks. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. It is the power of God for salvation. Again, all of that points back to Isaiah 52 and 53. It's the power of God. It's what will save us, is the gospel. Okay? Now, one of the things that, we'll pause there for a minute. One of the things that is important for us to understand is that when we think about what's required for our salvation, there's really a lot of things, right? We have to have mercy. God had to give us mercy. We had to have grace. We've got to have the gospel, right? We've got to have faith. There's a lot of those things. We're going to talk about in Romans, and we'll talk about it in just a minute, in a little bit greater extent about what's required of us. But all of those other things, the mercy and the grace and the gospel, all of those are ways that God has reached out to us. This good news He shared with us because we needed to know where we were. We needed to know what our sin had done, right? We needed to know how badly that that hurt God and separated us from God. We needed to know that there was no way that we could fix ourselves or save ourselves, or to use Romans terminology, justify or make righteous ourselves. We needed to know what it was that God did for us that He didn't have to do. All of those things. But that's where the power is. So that strong right arm of Isaiah that he talks about, the power of God, is really seen in this. The fact that He'll save us through what He's done for us in Jesus. And then notice who that's for. To everyone who believes. See, you've got the Romans, you've got the Gentiles of the Romans that are over here saying that yeah, you've got to believe in Jesus, but you got to do this. And you got the Jews saying, yeah, I agree, you got to believe, but you also need to add the Ten Commandments and the dietary laws and some of those kind of things. But he says it's to everyone who believes. And then he's going to talk about that faith a little bit more in verse 17. Now, we've talked about this already with the righteousness and justification. It's the same word in the original language. And one of the things that I told you, even if you didn't want to color all the key words, you ought to color the righteousness, justification words so you would see that every time. But also, I've heard people before, teachers and preachers, and they would say, well, there's a difference in believing and having faith. But there's not. The original word is the same. Now, believe and faith doesn't sound anything like each other, and I don't usually use Greek, but I'm trying to prove a point here to you. Pistis and pistuo. Does that sound close to each other? Pistis is the noun that's usually translated faith, and pistuo is the verb usually translated to believe. Are you with me? Same word, it's just the noun form of it and the verb form of it, see. So when he's talking about our faith, he's talking about our believing. That's what we do. So it's the power of God to salvation to everyone who believes. So what's required for salvation? What's required? What does he say in that verse? To believe. Now, here's why it's hard for us to talk about believe. Because it has become a word that we just want to argue about in the religious world. We want to debate about it. And believe is a word that we want to try to make the opposite of obedience. You either believe in believing to salvation or obeying to salvation. And if you talk about obedience, well, then you're saying belief isn't necessary. And if you talk about belief, you're saying, well, obedience isn't necessary. And even in our answers a few minutes ago, we can look right here and he says it's to everyone who believes. And what do we want to answer the question with? Believe and obey. Because we want to throw that in there. Now, understand, you've got to take a word in the way the writer uses it. and we've talked about this already, but you're going to hear me repeat it a bunch because you've got to get this, is that in Paul, now how many times have I said that, Eddie? In Paul. I'm trying to be fair with what Paul said. In Paul, believe includes obedience, but believe is putting our trust in God that He's going to do for us what we can't do for ourselves. In James uses believe as acknowledge the fact of who Jesus is. See? That's why James says that the devils also believe and tremble, but they're not going to be saved because all they're doing is acknowledging who He is. But if I'm trusting God is going to do what I want Him to, what I need Him to do that I can't do for myself, wouldn't I be willing to do anything that He asks me to do? So, this is an illustration. He hasn't really. Jeff goes to the doctor and he gets a diagnosis that his kidneys are kaput. Okay? And the doctor tells him, you've got a month to live. You don't get a new kidney, you're a goner. And Jeff starts calling everybody that he knows, and nobody has the right kind of blood type. And he calls me and he says, Corey, I need somebody that can give me a kidney. And I say, well, I'm an O type blood. Can you take? Well, yeah, I can take your kidney. And then he says, well, this is pretty dramatic. I'm not going to live unless I get a kidney. Would you be willing to give me your kidney? And I say, and some of you are thinking about it too hard, I say yes to Jeff, right? And then I say, but Jeff, for me to give you a kidney, I really want you to cut my hair for free the rest of my life. Now, Jeff, you know how much a haircut should cost, right? How long have you been cutting hair? 41 years. If you gave me a lifetime of hair cuttings, would that earn a kidney? No, would it? Because here's the reality is without the kidney, what's going to happen to Jeff? He ain't going to give nobody a haircut anymore, is he? He's going to die. Now, how quick would Jeff make that deal? Pretty quick, see? Obedience, don't think of obedience as we're doing something to earn our salvation or deserve our salvation. We're trusting God is going to save us. And because of that, remember what he talked about at the very beginning of this chapter? He was a servant, a slave. Why? Because He saved me, and I'll do whatever He wants me to. I hadn't earned anything. I don't deserve anything. So there are people in the realm of religious discussions that want to talk about by faith only, we mean all you do is believe, and that's it. But that's not what Paul is saying. And then there's some that we take that pendulum and we go too far the other direction, and we say, well, you know, belief is fine, but that's not really what does it. And I hope I live good enough to get to go to heaven. You see what we've done? So, let me give you another illustration. And I know this makes us uncomfortable. I can feel the tension in the air. It makes us uncomfortable. But if I'm wanting to go, let me think about my directions. I'm wanting to go to Fulton, Kentucky. Okay? And when I leave out here, I don't have a good sense of direction, and I head west, and I end up at the Mississippi River. Have I made it where I want to be? No. Let's say when I take off, I'll have a bad sense of direction, and I go east, I go right, and I end up at the Tennessee River. Have I made it where I want to be? Which one is better to be at? The Mississippi River or the Tennessee River? Neither. That's right. Because I want to be where? So either direction we go that's away from where truth is, we're just as lost either way. Are you with me? So if you ask Paul, what must I do to be saved? Paul would say, here's the list. Are you ready? Number 1, believe. Number 2, believe. Number 3, believe. Are you with me? If you define the way that he defines it. Now, hold your finger there and flip over to chapter 4 of Romans, and we'll talk about why that's the case. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Yep. And like we've talked about before, we want to equate works with obedience. And, you know, James is going to talk about, and again, we're not in James, but I'm trying to be fair with Paul and James. We want to run to James and compare it with Romans. James is using works. He is using works to talk about obedience. Paul doesn't. Paul never, ever equates works and obedience. In Paul, works is a mindset that I can earn or deserve. If I give Corey enough haircuts, I've earned my kidney, and then if I can earn it, then what can I do? Then Jeff can say, all right, we're done. No more free haircuts. I didn't know you were going to live to 92, you know. But it would never can you earn it, see. So notice what he says in chapter 4 and verse 4, and we'll get to chapter 4 eventually, but we're going to foreshadow a little bit here. He says in verse 4 of chapter 4, now to the one who works, his wages are not counted as a gift, but as his due. And to the one who does not work, but believes in him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is counted as righteousness. See, it's obeying, but it's the faith is what allows us for God to declare us righteous. It's trusting that God is going to make us righteous, that God is going to save us, because He's the only one that can. Now, here's why this is so important, is because we do sit here and say, well, I hope I can be good enough to, and we can't. And we get to points in our life where we struggle, and Paul's going to talk about later on how he struggles. And we struggle, and then we throw our hands up and say, well, I might as well give up because I'm never going to be good enough. And that's true, but it shouldn't cause us to give up. It should make us want to praise God that we're not good enough and He's saving us. Are you with me? And that kind of good news, I'm obligated to tell people about. That kind of good news, I'm eager to tell people about. See? Now, if you jump back up, I skipped over a few verses because for the Jews, he's going to give the ultimate example. This may not impress us as much as it would the average Jew, but notice who he gives us an example. What then shall we say was gained by Abraham, our forefather, according to the flesh? For if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about, but not before God. See, if I could earn it or deserve it, I would say, look at me and what I have done. I've given you enough haircuts, the kidney's mine. See? Or we would look at it and say, I've gone to church enough, I've invited enough people, I put enough dollars in the plate, whatever it might be, and now I can sit back and say, soul, take thine ease. We don't earn it. If we did, we'd boast, and we're going to see as we move forward in Romans, boast isn't a key word, but it's an idea you're going to see repeated, that we shouldn't boast in our own selves because we can't earn it or deserve it, but we can boast in God. And so notice what he says then. He says, for what does the Scripture say? Abraham believed God, and his faith, was counted to him as righteousness. Now, did Abraham obey? Sure. What would have happened if he hadn't obeyed? Been lost. That's right. In fact, when you look at Hebrews chapter 11, It says by faith, but here's another one. I really prefer translating that as by faithfulness. That's kind of the way that Hebrews has been using it. That faithfulness is that idea I'm trusting in God, but I'm continuing to put my trust in Him and showing that by being willing to do whatever He asks me to. See, it's when I think that I can earn it or deserve it that I get to a point where I say, well, my obedience is done. Does that make sense? So, go ahead. Yeah.
And they separate, you see, in their obedience. And that's the problem, that they think differently.
Yeah.
A lot of times when people ask me if I'm saved, and I say, yes, I'm convinced I am, I don't have time to sit there and lecture them for 2 hours all that faith, but I know what they're thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes you go into their minds.
Yeah. But we've got to get in a habit of being okay with using Bible terms in Bible ways. I had a study the other day and had someone ask me, now I'm going to use the word, I'm not sure if y'all use this word. And I said, that's a biblical word. And I don't care what preacher from wherever pulpit they stand, what they say, what does the text say? See, that's what matters. And if we can get, and this is hard to do, but if we can set aside what I've always heard or what Grandma and Grandpa always said or what my preacher always, if we can set aside kind of our how do we win the argument way of thinking about things and just with an open mind, what's Paul saying here? We'd be a lot better off and we'd understand a lot more about what he really wants us to get. Are you with me? Are you with me? It's okay to say no if you're not. That's the gospel that he's talking about. So back in verse 17 real quickly, he says, for in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. We'll pick up there next week and we'll talk about righteousness before we move into the bad news of things. But if you haven't already, go through and mark righteousness, justification. It's in the introductory material that we handed out, so you can mark all of that. But how many of you are old enough to remember the righteous brothers? How many righteous brothers were there? 2. I'm going to tell you about the 4 righteous brothers next week, okay? From the book of Romans. Now the righteous brothers aren't really biblical, so I've already messed up a little bit. But we're going to talk about the 4 righteous brothers of Romans next week. Those of you that are online, thank you for being with us and hope that you can be with us in person soon. And for those of you that are here, we're going to look at